The Beer Buzz podcast is sponsored by Tavour, one-of-a-kind brews you can't get anywhere else. Fill your fridge with unique craft beers you can't find locally. Access highly rated IPAs, stouts, sours, and more. Craft beer delivery made easy. New users who spend $25 in the Tavour app will get a $10 credit towards their next purchase. Use code BEERBUZZ, that's BEERBUZZ, at checkout. Visit Tavour at www.tavour.com and find the Tavour app on the Google Play Store and Apple App Store. Welcome to the Beer Buzz Podcast, the podcast that brings the craft beer community together. Join us as we dive into the world of craft beer, exploring its rich history, unique flavors, and the passionate individuals who brew it. Each episode, we'll sit down with the industry experts, brewers, and beer enthusiasts to discuss the latest trends, share stories, and uncover hidden gems in the craft beer scene. Whether you're a seasoned beer connoisseur or just starting your craft beer journey, this podcast is for you. Get ready to pull up a chair, grab a cold one, and immerse yourself in the captivating world of craft beer. So tune in and let's talk beer. What is going on, everyone, and welcome to the Beer Buzz Podcast. I am your host, Dakota. Joining me from the great state of Wisconsin, Pete. What's going on, boss?
Hey, what's going on, guys?
All right, so this has been a podcast we've talked about for years. This guest we've been talking about for years. We just didn't know when the hell it was going to happen. And so fortunately enough for us, today on the podcast, we are joined by owner, head brewer of Narrow Gauge Beer, our brewery in St. Louis, Missouri, Jeff Hardesty. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So glad to have you on. First and foremost, like I said before the podcast even started, this is a super biased opinion, so you can all get pissed off if you want. I think some of the best beer in St. Louis comes from Narrow Gauge, so just not a shock that you have to have them on the podcast. They produce great beer. Just want to clear the air. Best beer in St. Louis.
I agree, and that's Narrow Gauge is what got me really into the craft beer in St. Louis. I mean, when I moved to St. Louis 10 years ago, didn't really know what breweries were in the area, and then my older brother Mike introduced me to Narrow Gauge, and I fell in love immediately. So, Jeff, we want to start with a little bit about your background. I did a little research. You were an engineer, correct?
That's correct.
That's how you started, or you were an engineer before you got into the beer?
Yeah, so I worked for about 10 years in the engineering field prior to opening the brewery. So I graduated college in 2007, December. So I worked from 2008 up to 2016, to the end of 2016 in engineering, production engineering role. Later into some supervisor stuff as well.
Okay, and did you go to school in Missouri or?
Yeah, I went to University of Missouri-Rolla.
Okay, cool. Right on. And then
mechanical engineering there, and also I went to Washington University in St. Louis for my master's.
Oh, so you were a minor.
I was, yeah. No, that's great school. Really good times there. Great program. I really enjoyed my time there.
Little caveat real quick, Missouri S&T, one of the best party schools?
It can be. There's not a whole lot else to do.
And so that so how did that end? How did you transition into home brewing?
Yeah, so I started homebrewing, it was early 2011, I believe. My wife bought me a homebrew kit. I guess I showed enough interest in how beer was made for her to pull the trigger on buying a kit for me. So she bought me a kit for my birthday, and that kind of just set it off from there. And just going through the learning process and finding out that yeast does what yeast does, when all along I thought malt did all the flavor and so forth. So learning how beer actually was made and how you can mimic what you want to make it taste like what you want was super intriguing to me. And it just was like an obsessive hobby. So if I wasn't brewing, I was scrolling through forums or reading books about it. So
and I heard heard you had you had a beer club too. I mean, my older brother, that's how I was introduced through my older brother to you. I guess you guys were in a beer club. You guys brewed some beers together.
Yeah, so your brother Mike actually worked with my wife, so I originally met him through that, and I knew he homebrewed as well, and we just kind of worked out a day for them to come over, and I think the first beer we brewed was at my house, and he came over, and we just brewed up a beer, and he brought the kids out and whatnot. So, but I was part of SEL Hops Homebrew Club pretty much since the beginning. I missed the first meeting, so I was at the second meeting the club had, and that was an awesome resource there. It gave me confidence in the beer that I was making. It helped me in a lot of ways, learning from people that had been brewing longer, and just picking brains of everyone there to kind of see what they were try their beer. So it kind of streamlined the process of being able to try a bunch of things without having to make it all your own necessarily.
Yeah. So when was that point where you knew that you kind of wanted to open your own brewery? I mean,
Yeah, that I didn't really have that in mind for a long time. So I mean, I say a long time, like the first few years, it probably was I didn't have the confidence. That wasn't what I wanted to do. And I think as time built up, and just like my friends, I would try the beer, and I shared a lot of beer because I wanted to brew a lot of beer. So
sure.
it helped me get the confidence within that. And it was probably about 2-ish years in from when I started homebrewing. So it would have been like 2013 or 2014, actually, when my wife was actually on a work assignment in Maine. And that kind of like intimate settings. We got to go to some of the breweries around there, like Hill Farmstead and whatnot, and saw breweries in that form, not a brewery like you think of, like Anheuser-Busch. So it kind of made it a more like intimate thing to me, and something that I thought would be fun to do. And it was an option worth exploring with the age that we were, and we from there, my wife and I came up with a business plan, which our original goal was to open up like a brewery somewhere in rural Missouri. So our plan wasn't originally to be in St. Louis City or St. Louis City County, or county. Let me rephrase that: St. Louis County or the city. So we looked at a bunch of different properties, just like keeping our eyes out, seeing what was around, and we kind of came to the realization it was going to be very difficult for us to maintain that as well as work our full-time jobs to get going, and let alone the cost that it was going to be. So especially looking at it now, if we didn't even get to the point of like going to a bank before I met Ben and Dave at Cagino's, and that kind of changed direction on how we were doing it to help bring in other resources that we necessarily couldn't handle at the time. So I met Ben and Dave from Cagino's. I met Ben first, which so Ben and Dave are two of my business partners. My wife is also one of my business partners. But I met Ben and Dave, Ben first by buying like a beer dinner for Goose Island,
Okay.
from Ben, and Ben remembered who I was, and I started to see him at like side project perennial releases. So we kind of built a little bit of a friendship from that. And then there used to be the SCL Hops anniversary parties, which our homebrew club would pour at, and Mike Sweeney would get beer from all over the country to that event, which was an awesome event. It was great to be a part of. And they had some of my beer there. It was the first time Ben and Dave had beer. And of course, at the end of the festival, you're going to be a little bit drunk and up. And the conversation came up about like opening a brewery. And I kind of told them like my wife and I were kind of planning on that. And that kind of kicked off the initial discussion of putting the brewery in the basement at Cagino's.
Wow.
Which was probably a pain in the butt, right? I mean,
Uh,
you took me down there. I went down there, and
yeah,
it's not meant for tall people. I don't, if I recall.
no,
Um,
and I got two of the tallest brewers probably in St. Louis, ironically. I was down there for a while. And we're all happy to be out of the basement, but
oh, I bet.
the basement's definitely like a sentimental thing to me. Like I have PTSD when I go down there now, but I still love that space for what it brought to us.
Yeah, definitely.
So I do have to ask a question. So like when you were talking about like opening up a brewery in like rural Missouri, obviously
Yeah.
this is not rural Missouri what we're talking about where you're at, but did you have a spot in mind besides, finding your business partners at Cugino's? Like, did you have like a demographic, not a demographic, just a spot in St. Louis where you're like, there's not a brewery here. We might fit it. We might work here, whatnot. Did you have a spot outside of the rural spot of Missouri?
Not really. So like anything we looked at, I think the closest would have been like Pacific area. So we were trying to find something that could be close enough to get to, at the same time was far enough out to be like more like rural, more wooded area, just to give a different experience of what most breweries give within Missouri. So it was very much like trying to do the Hill Farmstead concept in Missouri. So like
So,
opening up a place like that.
so you were looking more like the farmhouse brewery kind of style then?
Definitely. So like IPA was definitely something we knew we would do, but my goal at that time was I wanted to focus morely on like mixed fermentation,
Okay.
which at the time mixed fermentation was pretty popular, and I'm thankful that route isn't how we went. Because it would have been we wouldn't have been able to, I think, achieve what we achieved rolling out with that style of beer. I think it would have worked out. I just think it would have been a lot more difficult.
So there's been a couple articles released since 2016, and narrow gauge has always been at the forefront of those. One of those articles said, I'm not going to quote it all, but that you guys were bringing a style of beer to St. Louis that they weren't necessarily familiar with, or that there wasn't a whole lot of. So can you touch on like kind of the style of beer that you guys are most known for, and then kind of what encapsulates the narrow gauge beer that we know today?
Yeah, definitely. So the hazy IPA is definitely what kind of stood out from our get go. So at the time, it was the style of beer I was trying to figure out how to make, because I was trading a lot of the beer I was picking up locally, like side project perennial stuff, for IPAs from Treehouse, Hill Farmstead, Alchemist, Trillium, all those places. So like I could not get it in St. Louis, so I went on the journey of I want to learn how to make it, and that started in like 2014. And we opened mid 2016. So I had a couple of years that I had been working on it, and the first batches they were rough. So like they would clear up. It was like trying to learn the process. There wasn't a whole lot of info out there. So I'm glad I was looking at this earlier than when we opened. So it was a style I was trying to mimic because I didn't want to trade beer for it anymore. So that got into my head, where like, hey, I could bring this to St. Louis. It's popular amongst the beer scenes in the Northeast, California. You're not really seeing it much here in St. Louis, but I think it would go well because St. Louis is probably the best beer city in the country, in my opinion.
In your opinion, right?
In my opinion. So when we opened with 8 beers on tap. So we had a hazy pale ale, our porter, and then 6 other IPAs. So I think it was Fallen Flag and a SHB Galaxy maybe. And then I had 4 batches I pulled like a carboy out of. So I did like dry hopping in a carboy and then carved those up and kegged them. So it was only 5 gallons with that. So we opened real aggressive with IPA, and it was almost instantaneously we realized how hard it was going to be to keep up, because we started with 2 fermenters. So essentially 6 barrels, or I was probably netting out about 175 gallons a week or so in the beginning. So like at that time, like that sounds like a ton of beer. Like there's no
It
way
does.
and like we filled growlers from the get go, and I basically was going to refill the tanks that were emptying within like 2 or so weeks of opening, and it was because we brought a style that nobody else was doing in St. Louis at the time, and it just clicked with people like it clicked with me, because when I had my first hazy IPA, I was kind of at the mode where West Coast IPA had run its course on me.
Yes.
And now I'm enjoying them again now. But I was like kind of over IPAs. And then I had my first hazy IPA, which was Melcher Street from Trillium. And I was like, is this? And it was back when they're in 750s. And it just
Oh,
like
wow.
kind of blew my mind. And it got me interested in figuring out what that beer was.
See, and the bias thing with me is my first ever hazy was OJ.
Okay.
So as soon as I had it, I was like, well, this is probably the best beer I've ever had. Now, obviously, a ton of people make beer, and so like now you start comparing other beers to whatever. So I've had Hot Butcher, I've had Treehouse, but the thing that gets me the most confused is like you guys from the very beginning were busy. Like people realized early on, like this hazy IPA thing that we haven't had very much of in St. Louis is really really good. And so, do you have PTSD or do you have like some like bad dreams about the two fermenter system that you guys started off with, and now you're like seeing the new system that you guys put in 2023? Like, there's got to be some bad war stories, I'm sure, in that basement.
Yeah, I mean, I started on a 3-barrel brew house, so I was doing double turns to fill 6 barrels. So when I was doing imperial stouts, then the first few I did were quad mash brew days, so they took me like 20 something hours to brew.
Jeez.
So that stuff I definitely don't like to think about. We upgraded to a 6-barrel brew house in 2018, which is still the brew house we brew on to today. And it added a nice difference in the brewery where we added rakes to our mash tun, so I wasn't hand stirring everything. Nor do Jake and Josh have to hand stir now. It made it a lot easier, a lot less work, because working out of the basement, you were carrying out buckets of spent grain. Like there was so much manual labor that went into it that anything you could cut out of it, and that's the real, I guess, PTSD stuff is the amount of stairs, the stuff you got to carry upstairs, not seeing the light of day, especially in the winter when you go in, it's dark out, you leave, it's dark out, you spend all day in a basement. So I enjoy having windows.
So when you had the business plan, you didn't have a building, I'm guessing, in the business plan yet, right?
Originally,
So when you saw, or when Kojima starts jumping on and you're like, all right, well, this is going to be it. This is where the brewery's going to be. What was your first initial um, expectation, or what was your first initial thought of having a brewery inside of a basement?
yeah. So it was kind of a combination of a lot of things. So going in there, realizing how much easier it would be to start that way as opposed to trying to buy out a building and do that from afar. So went down there, saw the space. Like initially, I was very hesitant of it, just because I thought basement, short ceilings. There's no way this is going to work. And then upon going down there, they were like trying to remember. It was like 108 inches from the concrete at that time to the ceiling. So it was a larger space, like, but in a sense, it was large for a basement. But that was about it. But like me wanting to get it going, I looked at it as like I'm willing to compromise this to be able to start, because I don't see us being able to do it any other way at this point. So I looked at it as a quicker foot in the door.
So so kind of hearing that kind of thing, when was the transfer to we're gonna put a bottling, or did you guys make a bottling line? Did you guys buy one? Did you guys rent one? Like how did you, or not bottling, sorry, canning line?
Yeah. So we started out growlers, moved on to crowlers, and that was basically a full-time job for somebody. So
Jeez.
I got stuck filling crowlers quite a bit, growlers and whatnot. So it kind of naturally led to the way of it making sense for us to get a canning line. And at this point, like I was happy with the basement, we were making it work. But this is also pre-canning, getting to the barrelage that we eventually get to. So I looked at it as we're going to be sending a lot better beer out there. by canning it instead of doing crowlers, so we can get a little bit longer time. DO level should be lower. So it was one of those things where I thought the product would get better going out, as well as help us alleviate some of the price point from the crowlers. So, which in turn it increased demand. So we were able to make more beer, can more beer, because we were moving beer quicker than we were with crowlers. So we put the canning line in 2018. Which was before we got the new brew house. So we were brewing on the 3-barrel brew house for maybe 6 months of that initial canning.
Wow.
Which would have been through like 6 fermenters at the time. We bought 4 additional fermenters in November of the year we opened.
Man. So I guess synonymous with that would be open line of distribution. So did you guys start just straight distribution from narrow gauge to, stores, or kind of how did you guys, facilitate the distribution with the addition of the canning line to move more beer?
Yeah, so we at this point everything was in house, so we weren't distributing anything. Everything was out the door, minus anything we would have been sending to like festivals. So that depended on the amount of beer we had on hand when we would be pouring at a festival somewhere else, some other state. Typically, you would try and fill up a pallet to bring the cost of the beer down for the festival and to kind of get more of your product in that market. So we would send occasional like pallet of beer out for stuff like that. But like within Missouri, we couldn't necessarily keep up with the demand that we had at that point in time when we added canning. So we we just kind of like, it was all going out the door there, so it was pretty easy and didn't have to deal with trying to figure out distribution and trying to meet a schedule that way, and so forth. So it was nice. Like, it really didn't matter what we brewed, and there was times I would show up and I was brewing that morning, because like at that time we were experimenting with so many different hops and IPAs in its own. So that was what we did for a lot of it, because that was where the demand was.
So what for you was like the first beer that St. Louis kind of gravitated towards from narrow gauge? Were like, I wouldn't call it a flagship, but what was one that, like, what's synonymous with narrow gauge? When people think of narrow gauge, what's the first beer that you think pops into their heads?
It's going to be either Fallen Flag or OJ Run. So I say Fallen Flag. Some people say Fallen Flag. A lot of people say OJ Run. So OJ Run being the first Imperial IPA we made, and we trying to think, when we put that batch on, I think we probably, it was a 6-barrel batch, so we probably netted out about 5.5 barrels, and we moved it in, I think it was like 2 days. The first.
Wow.
Jeez.
Something pretty crazy. I at this time I was still working my normal job, and Ben, my business partner, texted me like that they were like slammed. They needed help or something to go, so I actually had to take like a half day at my job at the time to drive out and start filling growlers and crowlers.
Wow.
So like, OJ Run was kind of mind blowing to me. I didn't expect the takeoff it was going to have when we released it.
I mean, now, and we're talking 2024 today, and it's still one of the best beers I think has ever been produced in not only the St. Louis market, but I'll say, it's the United States altogether. I mean, honestly, again, this is unbiased opinion. I know narrow gauge is in my backyard, but very, very unbiased. But I kind of want to talk about that. I want to dive into just hazy in general. So when you start producing hazy IPAs, like you said, you started with 5 on tap when you first opened the brewery. Kind of what was one of the hardships or one of the things that you felt you experienced the first opening a brewery, but having so many IPAs, how did you did you want to have different flavor notes? Did you already kind of had some recipes worked up where you're like, okay, this is going to be on the opening roster? Like, kind of how did you go about like the IPAs you produced right out of the gate?
So like the original one I worked on for years was Fallen Flag. So
Okay.
it always started as a Mosaic Citra IPA, and I kind of worked on it from there. So it was the concept of Fallen Flag, and that's what that beer became. So um, leading into that, that was kind of the formulation of a hazy IPA, and then from there, it's how do we build upon that. So like when I guess it was probably 2-3 months when we were open before we released an Imperial IPA. So we kind of experimented more with different hop varieties and things like that in the very beginning. So we had like Fallen Flag, and then we ran a SHB series, which was single hop beer. Or shitty homebrew is what was a running joke with buddies of mine. So it was like shitty homebrew. Is what they would always call my beer, like in a loving way. At least I hope. um, so it was an ode to that. So SHB, but single hop beers. So we would rotate single hops to see how they would be. So we did anywhere from Galaxy, Mosaic, Citra, El Dorado at that time. So that was one line that we ran that we would experiment with, and then we had another which was Oast. So like Oast houses is where hops were stored.
Okay.
So we just had Oast number thing we did. So we had like I think we did 9 batches of Oast. So we had like Oast 1 through 9. It was just different hop combinations we were trying to play around with. And then it was always more difficult doing the Imperials because of yeast supply. Okay. So whenever we got around to doing an Imperial, I assume it's because I had a new pitch of yeast coming. So I'm like, I'm going to finish out on an Imperial. So that was when we did OJ Run, and I honestly didn't expect it to do like take off like it did. So that definitely filled the Imperial gap a good amount. So we would do OJ Run, and then we also have a beer called Juice, which was also like join us in creating excellence is what it's called. So the acronym is Juice.
I was going to say one of my favorites is Cloud City though.
Yeah.
And I just tried the Queen's Cloud City.
Yep.
Yeah, it was very good.
So Cloud City was originally an Oast beer. So it was Oast number 2. So that beer birthed from the Oast series.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned something before we started the podcast, and I kind of wanted to dive into it real quick before Pete kind of pivots on his questions. But you said that you were interested in the fact that you found new things out about yeast and how yeast actually flavors the beer instead of malt. What kind of like pivoted from homebrewing to obviously owning a brewery and being a head brewer at your own brewery? But like, what were some of the biggest challenges and things that you faced with the introduction of yeast from homebrewing to just a bigger scale?
That was something I really worried about because like being early on, you can't afford fancy equipment, so you're gonna like lab equipment. So worrying about how much yeast you're actually pitching, how I was storing the yeast. So at that point, we were ordering commercial size pitches. So we would start on a pitch and of yeast, and then we would generally take it like 9, 8, probably not even that, 7 at that point, 7 to 9 batches or so. So we would harvest the yeast, and at that point we were using 1 strain of yeast pretty much. Not pretty much, that is what we were. So all our like porter was with that yeast strain. So it wasn't until later within professional level that I brought yeast into the equation more. But as a home brewer, I definitely enjoyed trying like Belgian yeasts and all sorts of yeast like that. So it later came back. It just took longer to actually get there than I wanted it necessarily to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we talk about experimental yeast all the time, and like different. I mean, a company that is all around beer is Omega Yeast. So like, I mean, seeing the things that they've done throughout the beer industry and how much yeast actually plays into a huge part of beer is I think still alarming to most consumers. But what do you got for him, Pete?
Just really quick. I'm frozen up there, aren't I? But you guys can hear me though, right?
Yeah. Okay. You're good.
All right. No worries, as long as you can hear the audio here. Jeff, some collaborations going on. We read something about a beer called Forever Expanding.
Yeah. So it's a beer we're releasing tomorrow. So we brewed it with our friends at Central Standard Brewing Company out of Wichita, Kansas. So we've brewed a few collabs with them. So anytime they come into town, we generally hang out. So I wanted to brew up a beer with them in our new spot because everything we did before was in the basement. So I wanted to have them out, check out the place. So we decided to try some different stuff with it. So we did. We actually sent the batch into the cool ship to essentially give it some initial cooling, but we did a dry hop, or not a dry hop, sorry, a hop addition in the cool ship. So we kind of did our normal whirlpool type amount of hops in that, and then once we had 180 degrees in there, we sent it back to our kettle and did a cool down whirlpool. So I think it
Okay.
around like 175 degrees, and we did a pretty large uh, hop addition into that. So it was
Okay.
kind of an experimentation with keeping amount more hops on the hot side, and then we double dry hopped it like we would double dry hop like our single IPAs or like double dry hop Fallen Flag levels. So a
Sure.
little
Sure.
less of a dry hop than what we do on some Imperials, but still pretty aggressive.
Yeah. Just kind of going back a little bit, maybe a year ago, I guess. Four Hands, they started doing that Transformers collaboration with a bunch of breweries, and I
Yep.
think their first beer was a collaboration with you guys.
Yeah.
Um, and I just kind of want to pick your brain a little bit and your thoughts about that beer that you guys did with Four Hands on that first one.
Yep. Yeah. So I think I'm trying to think that beer was in the works for a while because Kevin called me, and I don't think it was brewed until it probably had to be a year and a half after our initial conversation. So
Wow.
hazy IPA used like Cosmic Punch, so one of the engineered yeast that produce styles in beer. So it used that hazy IPA. Turned out quite nice. I know they had a tough time getting up and going with all the legality with the Transformer stuff.
I'm not gonna lie though. I'm not gonna lie. I'm gonna be honest here completely. I tried it and I had it on tap. I also had
Mhm.
it in cans. It just, to me, was more forehand style. I just didn't feel like it had any kind of narrow gauge feel to it.
Yeah,
And maybe that's just me. I mean, I kind of want to just hear your opinion on that.
yeah. It's. I mean, it can be different. So, if anytime you're brewing in a different facility, the processes are going to be different. So, I'm a firm believer in that like you can make anybody's beer anywhere with the right tools. So whether that is building out your own water profile or whatnot, but I think it just comes down to naturally it's going to take more like a four hands beer,
Okay.
but it should have some sort of flair brought from us. So like we may try something different because you'd be surprised the amount of places I've collabed with where they send me a recipe and they're pretty much identical to what our recipes are, but the beers taste drastically different.
Sure.
And a lot of that comes down to process, your yeast selection, and whatnot. So I think you're always going to fall into that unless the collaborative brewer tries really hard to make the beer taste like the other breweries. I think you're always going to have some flair of the brewery that brewed it, though.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, I guess let's talk about a little bit about the new space. You guys have, so right now there's no tap room, right?
That's correct. We do not have that yet.
And is that in the plan down the road or?
Yes, it is. So we finally got green light to start on that project now. So we're hoping to be there late summer. Have it open then, but like anything, you can run into snags everywhere, like we did in the relocation to our new building. So I don't like to put a date on it per se, but we're pretty confident it'll happen this year. Hopefully into summer timeframe, early fall.
So the next question I had was in relation to your collaborations. You guys have done a lot of collaborations through your young brewery, but like what would you say like the top three collaborations you've done so far have been? You don't have to put anybody over anybody else, but I'm just saying what are some of the favorite ones you've mentioned or know of, and then do you have any collaborations kind of in the works other than the one with Central Standard?
Yeah, so top three, it's always tough to pick something like that because they're all so memorable. But I kind of like to think back to first. So ironically, our first collaboration was with Four Hands.
Okay,
And it was a cool experience to go into their brewery, see their equipment, and how much I will say more professional of an environment it was because like it's a huge operation. It's got to take on a lot of planning to do something like that. So it was cool to see that and set up. It was a really good time hanging out with Andy Bergio and the crew there. So that was a memorable experience, something I never thought would happen. Another one would be collab with The Answer, which was the first collab we did at the brewery in the basement. So it was the first on-site one, and it was with a real good friend of mine, Brandon, came out, which he's no longer with The Answer, but like we're still in contact pretty regularly. So definitely a memorable one there, which we brewed other collabs with him under his brewery, Short Throw. So we've done a handful, and then I'm trying to think where else I would pick. It's tough to nail them all down, but I'm trying to think of where I would go. Probably like Dancing Gnome, which was also a pretty early on collab. This first collab I really did at another like hazy IPA producer. So it's enjoyable to go see their setup, how they were doing things. Great people there as well. Like you're pressed to find shitty people in the industry, to be honest.
sure. Yeah, because we had Steve Kreider on. We just released that podcast, and he talks a lot about the St. Louis brewing industry and everyone being so tight knit. And I'm a chef by trade. I've worked at a lot of St. Louis brewery, or not St. Louis brewery, St. Louis restaurants, and we're all tight knit. If everybody, nobody sees that part of it. Everybody sees, oh, you guys brew great beer, oh, you guys cook great food, but nobody sees how tight knit St. Louis as a whole has been. And the pivot I kind of wanted to talk about with being such a great community is in 2020, it seemed like the world shut down for it seemed like 20 years. And the St. Louis restaurant or hospitality industry really got hit hard. And I know the St. Louis brewing industry got hit hard. It's going to be a sour subject for a couple seconds, but is there anything that you guys during that time kind of learned and you guys still implement today? And then how did you guys kind of ride the storm throughout that whole transition?
Yeah, I mean, COVID was weird because going into it, it was such an unknown going to happen. And you mentioned the beer scene and how tight everybody is, and that was a very good sign of that. And like you mentioned, Kreider, I've brewed beers with Kreider. Kreider's an amazing person to brew with as well, and it's hard to discount that wouldn't be one of my favorite brew days either. But it was awesome to see everyone. How can I help you out? What can we do to help each other out? Because we knew things were unknown. I know like Omega goes to shut down, so it's like where's people going to get their yeast? So there was worrisome stuff that came along with it, and ultimately in the beginning, the support was there from a lot of the community. So our community, our enthusiasts, and our fans came out and kept us going. Very much in the beginning of the pandemic when it was so unknown. We didn't brew for like 2 weeks because I was worried, what am I going to do with all this beer if we can't sell it? And that was probably one of the worst mistakes we made because that was the beginning of pandemic where everyone's like, I want beer, I'm going to be at home. It like wiped our whole stat, like all of our production away. So we didn't brew 2 weeks, completely cleared us out, which was great to start over. It was kind of like a all right, this is our fresh start within COVID. And I mean, then COVID just kind of ran its course, like it did with a lot of things, and we just saw like the outcome lessen and lessen, and ultimately it led us to the point of distribution. This kind of gets back
Okay.
to your question about distribution and how we got to that point. But at that time, we had already closed on our building, so we closed on our building that we are in now in February of 2020. So it was
Wow.
February 28th of 2020, we closed on that building, and then 15 days later, they shut everything down. So it was worrisome, and there was a lot of things going through my head at that point, like what makes sense. And luckily, the people were there to carry us to that point. But as we were getting ready to transition into the brewery, we always knew we were going to do some distribution. So we made the conscious decision when our on-site dropped off to start distribution within St. Louis, and quickly realized like people still want our beer. They don't love driving to us all the time, or they may want a different experience because Cagino's is definitely different post-pandemic than it was before. There's a lot less bar seating, so it's more a restaurant setup. So that may deter some people that are just interested in coming to enjoy beer at a bar. So like as all that stuff kind of goes on, it led us into starting that distribution before we relocated into our building. And then it kind of paved the way from there. So people being able to get our beer outside the brewery seems to be like people are excited about. Like I get a lot of positive feedback from people that, hey, I found OJ Run at the store yesterday. They're sending me pictures of like getting our beer. I think I kind of went on a tangent there.
No, you're good. I want to touch base on the thing you mentioned about COVID, but because I think it's kind of funny that all happened all at once, COVID, and then you guys closed on the building. Like, was there an immediate panic? Like, we just closed on this building we're about to move into, and then now you're like, shit, do we even start brewing a beer?
Yeah, I mean it was weird. Like it put things in limbo a bit because it's like we probably need to wait out and see what's going to happen. And that was the point in time where like they were making it sound like social distancing like that was going to be the new norm forever.
Right.
And it was just like, how do we want to build this out the way we conceptually thought about it? And we definitely went back and forth on that. But ultimately, we knew it was in our interest of a business to succeed to get out of the basement. It was just becoming very obvious that it wasn't going to work long term out of the basement. So ultimately, we came to the realization that building was something we needed to for sure continue to pursue, even with the uncertainty of COVID.
Was that building? Were you supposed to move into that building before now or before 2023?
So we were originally supposed to move over there and like have tasting room, and then 2021 was the initial plan.
You guys went through hurdles. You went through a lot of hurdles to get that building up to inspections and all that stuff, right? You went through a tough time.
Yeah, it was a very difficult process. So some of the infrastructure of the building was done in a really odd way, such as the water. The water to that building tied into the neighborhoods behind it.
Oh, God.
So when we went to upgrade the service, essentially American Water told us no, that we couldn't through that route, even though the building did have the easement for that. So I argue that we should have been able to use it, but ultimately we weren't able to use it, and we had to fund a water main extension up Lindbergh to get water to the building. So
Damn.
when we did that, it took away all the funding that we had for the tasting room. So we spent a lot of time trying to get help from like city, county, state, and then they all kind of just pointed at each other when it came to the financial part of it. So it got to the point where like we had delayed long enough trying to get help and realized we need to just do this. Cut the tasting room, get the brewery moved over there, focus on sales to get us to the point of
Mm-hmm.
the tasting room. So we kind of regret taking the time we did to get moved over there to some degree, but a lot of it was out of our control. So we didn't move our production stuff over there until March of 2023. So we were over 2 years
Oh
behind
wow, yeah.
what we initially
But
thought.
but it's a beautiful space. I
Definitely.
stopped by before I left and grabbed some beer, and yeah, you got some merch in there. It's a really nice space.
Yeah, definitely. It turned out quite nice. Like the exposed wood on the ceiling and stuff that we didn't necessarily know was there. Definitely gave it a good vibe. We're excited to get a tasting room in there and have people experience narrow gauge as we necessarily want to present it. So it'll be the first time we've ever had a tasting room. Not to discredit Cagino's by any means, but I mean ultimately Cagino's was an establishment before we were there, so we
Mm-hmm.
were of an awesome place to have our beers showcased, and we look forward to doing it ourselves as well.
And
Awesome.
it's cool.
We'll have some of our beer on, so
I
as
mean,
long as they.
and it's cool to kind of have like a feel the dreams moment where like if you build it, they will come, kind of thing. You guys started out like that. I mean, your first couple months of opening your brewery, like you guys are busy beyond belief, and without a taste room, people still want your beer. Like you're making
Yeah.
great beer. So I mean, if you make the beer, people will buy it no matter where it is or how to get it. So, I mean, Pete was talking to me before we had this podcast. One of our sponsorships is Tavor, and
Mm-hmm.
you can get narrow gauge on Tavor, which means you can get narrow gauge in just about 30 states that
Yeah.
aren't St. Louis or aren't Missouri. So that's great that you're getting your beer into other people's hands that are in California or in Maine or Florida or whatever. I mean, that's the beer community and the beer distribution has definitely made breweries like yours that make an insanely great beer that not many people who don't come to Missouri can't get for themselves. So I just
Definitely.
love seeing great beer get drank. Pete, you got anything real quick before we close?
No, I think we covered it.
I got one more thing for you.
Yep.
If you had to, it's like picking a favorite kid, but I'm going to do it to you because why not? If you had to pick a beer that you produced or beer you've been a part of producing in the last, however long you guys have been open, what beer stands out the most, and what beer are you going to choose?
That is a
I know,
tough.
I know.
Um, but I got to go to something that's out of the norm. So like honestly, like I opened this up. Mixed fermentation was my passion as a home brewer. So I would go with probably Anthology Blend One, which I remember when that beer carved up and I had it, and I was like, "Holy shit, this is awesome!" Um, it's still a beer like I don't have a whole lot of the bottles sitting around, but occasionally, like I'll have a friend with a bottle open one around me. So I think the last one I had a buddy of mine from the homebrew club, Rick, brought a bottle to a homebrew club meeting we had at the brewery, and we opened it and got to drink one of those. So that's
Wow.
Awesome.
probably my choice would be that beer. But an easy everyday pickup would probably be Old Town Pills, to be honest.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
I lean more towards lager, but I won't turn down a Fallen Flag, Double Dry Hop Fallen Flag, or so.
Yeah. You can list off every beer you make. There's not a bad beer that comes to mind. But
No,
I want to
agreed.
touch on this real quick because Pete and I are craft beer drinkers, reviewers by trade. And can art is, I feel like, everything when it comes to picking something off a shelf.
Yep.
People eat with their eyes. People see cans with their eyes. Are like, okay, I'm going to grab that. Can you talk a little bit real quick about kind of the direction in which when you guys produced cans and can art was a thing, kind of where did you draw your inspiration for the can art?
Yeah, so I mean, the hand drawn stuff was very much like Trillium esque, and I always enjoyed their artwork. It was something different. I liked the art behind it. So having the artistic touch to the label, I thought was something to build upon. So
It does remind me of a Trillium, and I just had Trillium the other day. I love Trillium.
so Jeremy that works at Cagino's drew most of the labels. I drew a few of them, but he like drew the OJ Run, the Fallen Flag, Rocket Appliances, Sparkle Motion, all the better ones he drew. I drew Juice's label, so join us in creating excellence, and one we use for like Zab Track and coffee, so it's a coffee cup drawing. But yeah, it was definitely an inspiration of Trillium at that point, which further led me into like I want all of our labels to come from art of some fashion. So I actually do a lot of like photography based labels as well. So even if
Cool.
like an abstract looking thing, it may be a zoomed up portion of a photograph or something that I've taken. So still trying to tie art into the labels without having to hand draw them all, which takes quite a bit more time.
Yeah, definitely unique. And you know, when I see, because not many people I feel like do white labels. And maybe
Yeah.
I'm wrong. I haven't had a lot, but like, yeah, when you said Trillium, like I have one in my fridge that I was looking at to try. Yeah, you see the white label.
Yeah.
But then like, there's something about a narrow gauge label that you're just like you can pick it up off the shelf and before you even read it, you're like, oh, that's narrow gauge. So I think that's unique. I think that's a nice little niche you guys got. And I mean, obviously you're doing it, but you've been doing it well. So keep doing it. I appreciate you, Jeff, for coming on the podcast, taking time out of your busy schedule. Again, I appreciate all the technical difficulties you survived through.
I think I caused most of them.
But for people listening to this show, if you want to catch or try some narrow gauge beer, and you're not in St. Louis and you're available on Tavour, reach out to Tavour and see if you can get a 6-pack of some narrow gauge beer. There's not a beer that you will have from narrow gauge that sucks. I can guarantee that. If you want to check them out on Instagram, they're at narrow gauge beer, narrowgaugeSTL.shop. If you want to pick up some maybe some glassware or just kind of see what they have going on. We are the Beer Buzz Podcast. We release a podcast every week featuring different people in the brewing industry, whether it be owners, brewers, head brewers, TikTok, you name it. Who knows? We're constantly interviewing people. Just want to know what goes on in the beer industry, and such as Jeff himself, he gets to talk about his brewery. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. If you want to hit us up on email and you want to be a part of the podcast, we're always looking for new guests. But again, we release a new podcast every week. So please stay tuned. Until next time, folks, cheers.
Cheers.
Yes.